see, we find Israel, that city right there, getting ready to go back, and we know by reading ahead, it's not a spoiler because hopefully you've read this before. Up by the Red Sea, and they'll cross over the Jordan and attack Jericho, which we have all sorts of archaeological evidence that they burned the place down and began their taking of the promised land there. So, chapter 3 in Deuteronomy reminds us that Moses is not going to be able to go into the promised land. And back in Numbers, he rebelled against God himself. The people were complaining, preaching the kid. I don't know, your kids probably don't do that. Fine. They were angry. I want water. We don't have water. And so God said, speak to this rock. It'll burst open and water will spew forth. Well, Moses was kind of angry at himself as kind of the parent of Israel. Got up there and struck the rock a couple of times. He disobeyed God as well, just as much as the people. And God said, you know what? Because of your disobedience, you're not going to go into the promised land. And so in chapter 3 of Deuteronomy, Moses reminds them. He tells them, I made a mistake. I messed up, and because of it, I have to live with the consequences. I'll never go. And so if you follow that little dotted arrow and go up to where it says Moab, to the right of the Dead Sea, there's a mountain there, and that's where Moses disappears, right? He goes and dies at the mountain. You want to read the last chapter of Deuteronomy, first chapter of Joshua, and then you can read about this instance. But he tells them, I'm not going to go in there. I'm not going to be able to go into the promised land. Now, all of this 40 years, right, there's battles that have to be fought. There's some in between chapter 1 and chapter 6. You can go back and read that. There's sacrifices that have to be made, lots of reminders, some attitudes that need adjusting. That sound familiar? Lots of training, lots of teaching, lots of leading, just like a parent when we raise our own children to prepare them to be adults. We go through all of the same types of issues, maybe not to the same extent, but certainly the same issues. So in our passage today, Moses is doing just that. He's teaching Israel how to raise godly families. Now, let's see how Moses' instruction to Israel can help us raise godly families. I'm going to provide you 3 requirements for raising godly families out of this passage. Then go on to the next slide for us. Number 1, love God and love your neighbor. You could have probably guessed that one from verses 1 to 5. Notice in verse 1 to 5, Moses implores the people to remember the commands of God and to do them, to act upon them, so that their sons and their sons' sons will be able to remain in the land. This is a great conditional promise. God says, follow me, trust me, obey me, and I will provide you this land. And if you read the history of Israel, they failed many times. And one time carried off into captivity, into Babylon. So chapter 6, verse 4, we find what's called the Shema. It means to hear, right? Shema means to hear. Hear, O Israel, is how it's translated for us, but it doesn't mean to just listen like you're hearing me today, not just what do you call those things? AirPods. Hearing assist, right? So to help you hear better. You don't have to buy hearing aids. So I'm like, that's much cooler hearing aids than, so when it gets time for me to have them in a couple dozen years or so, then I will buy AirPods that look much cooler than having. He's been trying to get me to buy hearing aids for a long time, and I'm like, I'm never putting the hearing aids in here because that's my driving gear, and then I'll have to hear what's going on. Hear, O Israel, doesn't mean just to listen, it means to obey, right? To do what we're told. Now, Jesus felt so strongly about this passage that he repeats it in Matthew chapter 22, and that's the one that you're probably more familiar with. The greatest command, he says, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with with all your soul and with all your mind. And then he adds the second one. He says the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. So ultimately, to raise godly families, we got to teach our kids to love God, to love our neighbor as ourselves. That's what Jesus told us. He said, this is all the commands of the Torah wrapped into two, right? The first and greatest commandment, and the second one that's like it. That means you can't complete the first unless you complete the second as well. So you have no closer neighbor, right, than our children, blood of our blood, right? Our children, our family. Now, sometimes when we get older, we got siblings and all that. We may not like the family all that, right? But they're still our neighbor, and we have to love them. You can't love God unless you love your family like yourself. Now, the best way to teach our kids to love God is to love them the way God loves them. What's the first and most important way God loves? Anybody know? Sacrificially. Sacrificially. Romans 5:8 says, God demonstrates his love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. He demonstrated the love, right? So that ought to teach us as well. It's not just saying that we live sacrificially, but we demonstrate our love for our family, men